there we are. There's another stretch of sand, and that's the Pacific Ocean. It's the last few minutes of light here. There's a big, very bright moon up in the sky, a few clouds scudding around. So it's out there, long way out there, under the sea, that the earthquake originated on the 11th of March 2011. And all along Japan's northeast coast, the tsunami came in. I think it was about 12 meters high when it came in on this beach. And it was a year or two after the disaster that I began to hear the kind of stories I was not used to hearing. People told stories of mysterious figures they'd seen, voices they'd heard, of ghosts of the tsunami, the people who died in the tsunami, who were coming back to communicate with the living. A cab driver in the city of Sendai picked up a sad-faced man who asked to be taken to an address that no longer existed. Halfway through the journey, he looked into his mirror to see that the rear seat was empty. He drove on anyway, stopped in front of the levelled foundations of a destroyed house, and politely opened the door to allow the invisible passenger out at his former home. Yukiko Onodera is a spirit medium in Tagajo on Japan's northeast coast. Half of the town was overwhelmed by the wave, but her home was out of its reach. In the upper story of her house is the room where she communicates with the other world. Two life-size statues of Kannon-sama, the Buddhist deity of mercy, stand beside an altar bearing offerings of rice, fruit and sweets. And a tiny Shinto shrine is hung with white paper streamers folded in the shape of lightning bolts. After the powerful earthquake on the 11th of March, the road outside Mrs. Onodera's house was choked with cars fleeing from the direction of the ocean. Through the window of her upstairs room, the traffic jam extended as far as she could see.
I started seeing lots of dead people crying, "Help me!" Each one of them was dripping wet. Because the traffic jam was so long, the quickest way for them to escape was to run on top of the cars. There were the dead people who had drowned in the tsunami. Some still reached out for help, screaming, "Help me! Help me!"
How does it feel to see dead people like that? It must be upsetting.
I could hear their voices for the next 3 days, and for a while it was really terrible for me.
So we're driving along the coastal strip. This is an area called Yuriage. Used to be a village here, and now there's nothing.
I got out to have a look around.
So this is a grim sight. This is a small, lonely-looking, grey little cube of a house. Plants growing all round, and the door wide open. There's nothing left except on the wall is a clock, and the hands are stopped at 2:48 p.m. Of course, the earthquake was at 2:46. The moment when the hands on that clock stopped, the lives of the people who lived here turned on a pivot. 5 years after the tsunami, some of its survivors have moved to new houses and apartments, but tens of thousands are still living in grim metal boxes, erected as a temporary measure in the months after the tsunami. We visited one in Ishinomaki. So we've arrived in a room in one of the temporary housing centres It's just a container really, but it's very cosy inside. It's got tatami mats on the floor, and there's a group of people very busily setting up tables and chairs and preparing food for the people who are about to arrive here. Café de Monk is a mobile cafe run by Reverend Taiyo Kaneta, a charismatic Buddhist priest and an avid jazz fan. The idea is to provide company and consolation for displaced survivors of the tsunami who might be reluctant to seek out formal counselling.
At first, we were preparing meals for people who lost their homes. But as a priest, I also wondered how I could offer moral support. I thought a cafe would make it easier for people to approach us. And then this name fell from the sky. Café du Monk. In Japanese, the word monku means complain. So we listen to people's monks, their pain and their suffering. Also, I'm a jazz fan, and there's something particular about the music of Thelonious Monk that matches the mood of the visitors.
Café de Monk's really underway now. It's very lively. There's about 25, 30 people here now sitting around, and people are tucking into the cakes. They've got cups of coffee and green tea. The masseur is hard at work, pummeling the back of an old lady, and Reverend Kaneta is sitting in front of the kind of altar where the tablets are and the incense, and having a private chat with the lady. They're both kneeling down. The black lacquered Ihai memorial tablets bear the names of deceased family members. Many of them were washed away by the tsunami, and their loss is deeply felt. At Café de Monk, Reverend Kaneta gives out replacements for these precious relics of the dead.
I lost a child 40 years ago, and his ihai was washed away in the tsunami. But the priest said he would make a new one for me and insert the spirit of my son into it.
Tell us how it felt when you lost your son's ihai and what that ihai represents.
The ihai is my son. I lived, but my son was swept away.
Reverend Yozo Taniyama is a Buddhist priest and an academic at Tohoku University. He told me about the intimate relationship between the living and the dead in Japan.
Around half the homes in Japan have a Buddhist altar called Butsudan. In the middle of the Butsudan, there's a statue of Buddha, and next to it is an ihai. It is believed that the soul of the deceased is actually contained within the ihai. And in this disaster, some people actually went out of their way to return home specifically for the ihai and lost their lives.
Of course, after the earthquake, people ran back to their homes to save the children or their elderly parents. But what you're saying is they also went back to save their dead ancestors, right?
Yes, because this ancestor can help us, living people.
So this is the Kitakami River, which is the biggest river in northern Japan. And the countryside around it is superb, really. You've got this range of hills in the background, speckled with snow at the moment. And when I turn round, the other direction inland, this was a village called Kamaya, a few hundred people, a couple of hundred houses, and a primary school, Okawa Elementary School. The teachers very efficiently evacuated the school after the earthquake. The classes were all lined up in the playground. And then for some reason, that's where they stayed. For 51 minutes, they stood in the playground as the tsunami bore in. 74 children and 12 teachers died at the school. So we're walking around the school now. The walls have been gnawed away at. One of the outer wings has fallen over. And you can see into the dark classrooms. Most of their remains were recovered within a few days or a few weeks. But there were 4 children who have never been found. Several of the mothers, and one lady in particular was the first, qualified as a digger driver so that she could personally carry on the search for her daughter and for the other children who are missing. In every culture, bereaved parents will do all they can to lay to rest a lost child. But in Japan, the physical remains of the dead have a still greater significance, as Reverend Taniyama told me.
その骨とか遺品を大切にするのは
In order to keep our relationship with the deceased, we have to help their souls rest in peace. There's a particular risk that the souls of people who died in accidents or disasters could turn into ghosts. It is believed that by performing religious rituals with those remains, we can calm their souls. People believe that once spirits turn into ghosts, they might cause harm to the living. But once in tranquility, they will protect the living.
Of course, many people believe that's what has happened in this region, isn't it? There have been many reports or stories about ghosts. You're a priest, but you're also an academic. So I suppose you can interpret those kind of stories in 2 different ways. One is you could take them literally and say, well, there are spirits, unquiet spirits, who are trapped and who are causing mischief and need to be soothed with the rituals. The other is, a more academic, psychological interpretation, is to see it as a symptom of the trauma that people have had, not just individuals, but the whole community, coming out, manifesting itself in this way. How do you see it?
私は個人的な経験があって幽霊は存在すると思ってるんですね。
Personally, I do believe in them. But from an academic point of view, we can't explain whether ghosts exist or not. For those who do believe, religion can help. Those who don't need religious rituals.
宗教的な対応をする必要がない。
We've arrived at Tsudaiji Temple, the Zen temple where Reverend Kanata presides. It's a very impressive wooden structure with carved dragons and monkeys by the look of it up there. It's got a green copper roof. It's got tiled walls. The snow is beginning to melt and slip off them. In the weeks after the disaster, Reverend Kanata performed more than 200 funerals for people whose local temples had been destroyed. He spent years counselling and comforting survivors. Many thousands of people have come to talk and shared their troubles with him at Café de Monk. But the consolation he's provided has not ended with the living.
At Café du Monk, I'd been listening to the voices of people who had lost loved ones. They were experiencing unimaginable feelings of loss. But at the same time, I also heard the voices of the people who had died so suddenly without even knowing what was happening. So they also had very strong emotions. And I was hearing those voices from 2 different directions.
One day, Taiyo Kanata received a call from a local man with a bizarre story to tell. Reverend Kanata and I talked to him at the temple. He asked us not to use his name. We'll call him Takeshi Ono. Mr. Ono's home is inland. He was shaken dramatically by the earthquake, although the tsunami came nowhere near. But watching the images of the engulfing wave on television, he became curious.
これ本当のこと言った方がいいんですよね。自分その時、
I guess you could say I went sightseeing. I drove as far as I could, and then I started to see the rubble. Even at that point, I realized something was wrong.
戻る最中からですね。
And so you drove back, and tell us what happened that evening.
その晩、
In the middle of dinner, I suddenly got it into my head that I had to protect my family. I can't remember anything after that point, but according to my wife, I started licking my jumper. I wandered around the house shouting, "We should all die. We're going to die anyway." And then I went out into the field and started rolling around in the mud and shouting.
Tell us what you saw.
泥だらけの家族とか、
Families covered in mud, naked people. I think they had died in the tsunami.
窓見ると人がいたりして、それで
This extraordinary behaviour lasted for 3 days. At times, he threatened to become violent and even waved a knife. Eventually, his frightened family brought him to the temple.
夢を見ているような状態でしょうか。
It was like he was in a dream. His eyes were half open. The first thing I asked him was whether it was a good thing or a bad thing to go sightseeing in the devastated area at that time. I asked how he even got into that area. Vehicles weren't allowed. He said he made his own emergency vehicle sign, and that's how he got in.
And did you take him into the main hall very soon, or did you talk to him somewhere else, like here first?
いや、部屋でですね。
No. First of all, I needed to establish whether he thought he'd been possessed. I asked his wife and mother as well, and they all said yes. So I asked them if I could read the sutras that help the spirits go to the place they are supposed to be. They said yes, please do that. And that's when the rituals started.
今回だけではなくて、私がやるときは必ずそういうふうに。
Reverend Kanata chanted a Buddhist sutra as Mr. Ono kneeled before him. He beat the temple gong, struck its drum, and splashed him with holy water. Mr. Ono took up the story.
それで手が
After the reading, my arms were raised. I felt completely refreshed. I felt like I was back to my old self.
As you understand it, what had happened to you?
入っちゃいけないところに
I trespassed where I shouldn't have gone, and I regret it. I think I was
疲れちゃっ
possessed.
たのかなと思ってました。
So what were these spirits that had possessed him?
I don't know. 何回も言うようですけれども。
They visited the devastated area and behaved inappropriately. Japanese people believe that if you go into such a place with such an attitude, you'll be punished.
Reverend Kanata's wife, Yuko, plays a central role in the life of the temple. She told us about another victim of possession, a young woman named Rumiko. Over a period of weeks, she came repeatedly to Reverend Kanata, possessed by a succession of men, women, and even animals. The most intense and upsetting case was the spirit of a young child.
やっぱり小さな女の子の可愛らしい声なんですね。
It was the voice of an adorable little girl saying, "Mommy, I'm sorry." It wasn't her normal language. Rumiko had a lot of strength, so I had to hold on to her so tightly that my arms went purple. The child was in the middle of a pitch-black tsunami, with things swirling around her, and she was very scared. It seems she had let go of her brother's hand, and she was saying, "Mom, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I put all my effort into becoming the mother and telling her, "It's okay, Mom's here." Then I said, "There is a bright light over there, and come walk with Mom." I thought of it as a tunnel, and I told her, if you keep going, you will see everyone. The child said, I'll do that, and she went ahead. At that point, all the power went from Rumiko's arms.
This went on for a long time, didn't it? And there were repeated sessions like this. They must have been exhausting.
There were many people who appeared as ghosts, and through them, I learned the true horror of the tsunami.
So we've just got on the bus and we're on our way to see a man named Masashi Hijikata, who's a local publisher who holds meetings called Kaidankai, which literally means strange tale gatherings. And these are occasions where people, members of the public, come together, sit down, talk, and share stories of ghosts and mysterious happenings from here in Sendai and from towns and villages across the region.
Ghost stories have a long history in Japanese culture, like No or Kabuki theatre. In this area, we naturally hear stories about the tsunami. It doesn't matter if they're rumors or misunderstandings. Sharing such experiences can bring acceptance and peace of mind.
It's very clear that Tohoku people, by and large, aren't afraid of ghosts. They see them as part of nature and almost part of daily life. But there are cases, aren't there, of more frightening negative experiences, like the stories we've heard of people being possessed by spirits and going to priests to ask them to exorcise them and cast them out. What do you make of those kinds of stories?
The fact that people can be helped through the telling, listening and reading of kaidan is testament to the power of culture to help people recover. Of course, there are people who can't be helped this way. Perhaps they show symptoms of PTSD and can't come to terms with their experience. So, just as in a tsunami, everyone runs in different directions to save themselves. I think each person must find their own path to recovery.
胸の上に白い花が添えられていた。それは靴の中に入っていた。
Mr. Hijikata organised kaidan writing competitions and published the winners in an anthology. One of them was written by a young woman named Ayane Store.
柔らかさを。その度に最後まで触れることのできなかった父の濡れた皮膚を思い。
Ayane lives in Sendai, the region's biggest city, which was powerfully shaken by the earthquake.
3月11日は
I was in my apartment as I had the day off work. At 2:46, I felt a large tremor. I was spun around the room in circles. I tried to call my family in Kesenuma, but I couldn't get through on my mobile. When things had calmed down, I went to a public phone box, and my mother, sister, and grandparents were all at home. They hadn't heard from my father, who was at work, but they assumed he was fine.
Anxiously waiting for news from her family, Ayane tried to resume some kind of normal life.
先に花を見た。
I visited a public bath in Yamagata. I put my boots in the locker and kept the key on my wrist the whole time. After I had finished using the bath, I got ready to leave. As soon as I put my foot in my boot, I felt something under my heel and saw a white flower inside. I wondered how long it had been there. The locker had been locked and I had the key. If it had been in my shoe while I was walking, I would have noticed, and it didn't look like it had been trampled. It was spotless, as if it had been just plucked.
It was 10 days before Ayane's family learned the tragic truth that her father had perished in the tsunami. She hurried back to Kesanuma. There, in the family home, he'd been laid out in his coffin.
I looked at his chest and saw the white flowers on it. At first I thought the mortician must have put them there, but then I realized I had seen them before. It was the same flower I had seen in my boot in Yamagata.
What do you think this flower was? Do you think it was some kind of communication from your father? Or was it just a coincidence and a symbolic event?
When I found the white flower, it reminded me of our relationship. Writing a story was a way of telling him what I wanted to say, and a kind of prayer.
So we're about to take the bullet train back to Tokyo. We're at the station, and I've just seen this amazing, absolutely enormous full moon rising out of a sheath of clouds. I've never seen anything like it. It almost looked like the sun rising. And in a funny way, it reminds me of the rather mysterious character of this region, the close relationship which people here have with both the natural and the supernatural world. And there's this question of ghosts. And I don't think it really matters whether you believe in the literal existence of ghosts. I'm not sure that I do. But what's more important is that these experiences feel genuine to those who've had them. And they express very sincere emotions and genuine needs. But it also expresses, I think in the end, a sense of reconciliation with death and with the dead, and maybe even a way forward out of the disaster for this place.